This is the Bugatti Veyron Vitesse, and it is the ultimate Bugatti Veyron. That's saying a lot because the Veyron was sort of the ultimate car, or at least it was back in the mid-2000s when it first came out. It was the car every kid dreamed about, and today I'm going to review the king of the Bugatti Veyron lineup. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my new online enthusiast car auction website with cool cars from the modern era. If you're looking to buy a cool car from the 1980s and up, Cars and Bids has the best selection and variety with auctions running all the time of cool, interesting cars. And if you're looking to sell a cool car from the modern era, Cars and Bids is the place you will get the most views and the most money for your cool car. Check out carsandbids.com. I've borrowed this Veyron from a viewer here in South Florida, and I'm going to start with a little overview. The Bugatti Veyron was the most amazing car in the world when it came out back in the mid-2000s. It was the fastest car in the world. It had over 1,000 horsepower. It cost over $1 million. It was amazing. Everybody knew the Bugatti Veyron. As the Veyron aged, Bugatti came out with better and better versions. In 2009, they debuted the Grand Sport, which was basically a regular Veyron, but with a removable roof to become a convertible. A couple years later, they debuted the Super Sport, which was a Veyron, but with even more power. And then after that, they gave us the Vitesse, this car, technically the Grand Sport Vitesse, which is basically a convertible model with a removable roof like a Grand Sport, but with the extra power from the Super Sport. This was the final and best version in the Bugatti Veyron lineup. Now, I've already reviewed the standard Veyron, but I decided to do this one too, with a little more detail, and because this is the pinnacle model in the Bugatti Veyron world. The regular Veyron has only 1,000 horsepower. This has 1,200. And like I mentioned, it has a removable roof as well. It's a convertible. And it's extremely limited, ultra rare, with values probably in excess of $2 million. That, of course, makes this car incredibly special, and today I'm going to show you everything else that makes it special too. First, I'm going to take you on a thorough tour of the Vitesse and show you all of its interesting quirks and features. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it. I truly can't wait, and then I'll give it a Doug's score. All right, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the Veyron Vitesse on the outside, and I want to talk about this color scheme, which is beautiful. This isn't just blue, it is bare carbon blue, and you can see in the sunlight it looks fantastic, tremendously striking, unbelievably beautiful, really a really gorgeous color. I think it's perfect for this car, and Bugatti must have thought so too, because they used it for their initial unveiling of the Vitesse and as their press car. And I'm not just referring to this color, this car. This was the initial Veyron Vitesse displayed at the Geneva Auto Show when Bugatti unveiled the Veyron Vitesse for the very first time, and then it became Bugatti's press and display car, and every time the Veyron Vitesse was shown or tested in a magazine, it was this car that was used. And the owner told me, fun fact, as a result, this is the last Veyron ever sold, because Bugatti kept it as their own car throughout Veyron production, and after they sold off the last production Veyron, then they sold this one to him, the very last Veyron sold, and the Bugatti display car. That's a pretty cool thing. Now, next I want to talk styling, because to me, the Veyron has never been the most insane of hypercars. When you compare it to more modern hypercars, Pagani, Koenigsegg, the McLaren P1, the LaFerrari, this has kind of a tame look to it. I've always felt the Veyron was beautiful, it just was never crazy, over-the-top striking, and I always felt the reason for that was they kept the design, the styling kind of toned down. The real marvel was its engineering. That's where this car was a trailblazer. The thing that was so impressive, the top speed, the performance, the power, the engine. At the time, there was no category called hypercar. The Veyron invented that segment, and it seems Bugatti didn't want to take any crazy leaps or risks with the design since they put all of their effort into the engineering. It's a beautiful car, just not a totally insane, crazy head turner. unless you know what it is. With that said, there are some interesting extra items worth noting on this car. One is the sheer amount of air holes out here. You have the grille in front, of course, for air to pass through, and then you have two little side grills next to the front grille. Then you have giant air intakes behind the passenger compartment on either side, driver and passenger, and then you have even more air intakes above the cabin for even more air to come in. That, of course, is to bring as much air as possible to cool this car's massive engine. And an amazing Veyron statistic, at top speed, this car takes in as much air in a minute as a normal person breathes in 4 days. That's incredible. By the way, one other interesting thing up here, the headlights, the Vitesses are modernized compared to the original Veyron. You can see they have this LED light pipe running across the top and then 3 vertical LED pieces, kind of a distinctive look. Although my favorite part is the turn signal, which is this tiny little LED strip at the bottom corner of the light. Nothing too crazy here, but a different light than you'd see in your regular original Veyron. And next up, we move around to the back of the Vitesse. I want to talk about the spoiler, which, as you can see right now, doesn't even look like it exists, but there is a spoiler here. It's just down to be flush with the body and make the car as slippery as possible. With the spoiler down, the car is in its smoothest state for air traveling over it, and it can go 255 miles an hour, which is unbelievable. But if you remove the roof, as I've done, 2 things happen. For one, your top speed decreases because of the added drag created by taking that panel off. Your top speed goes down to a mere 233 miles an hour. Maybe more amazingly, if you remove the roof, since it changes the car's aerodynamics, the spoiler can sense if the roof has been removed, and then it changes its angle of attack ever so slightly to provide the same level of downforce that you would get if the roof was in place. That is pretty amazing attention to detail. But like I said, this is this car's slipperiest state for top speed, fast driving. But if you want to take it on a racetrack and improve your handling, there's a mode for that. You press this little button in the interior with a Veyron on it and a few arrows, and then the car changes. On the outside, you can see the wing comes up, the car lowers, and now it's in handling mode, which is intended to give you more downforce for better track laps, better steering and handling performance on the racetrack. Obviously, with the spoiler coming up, that creates drag, so the car won't go as fast. So if you want to go back into top speed mode, you have to go back to the car's regular slippery configuration, and then you can have better aerodynamics. And by the way, if you're going really fast and you slam on the brakes, the rear spoiler can tilt upwards to create drag and act as an air brake. It does this automatically and instantly if you're slowing down fast. And when it's being used as an air brake, it provides 70% of the braking power as a normal, regular, everyday car's actual brakes, just from the drag that this spoiler creates. That is unbelievable, but so's this. This car does 0 to 60 in about 2.7 seconds, but because of all its braking power, it can actually stop from 60 to 0 even faster than it can accelerate from 0 to 60. Unbelievable numbers from the Veyron. And speaking of crazy numbers for this car, let's talk tires. When this car first came out, there was an enormous amount of public interest in the tires because it was reported that you had to change them every couple of years at a cost of over $50,000, and you had to ship the car back to the factory in France in order to replace the tires. Fortunately, since then, things have become a little bit more rational. The owner told me that when he bought the car, they told him the car doesn't have to come back to France for new tires, just the tires do. The dealer can take off the tires, the wheels, send them all back to France, and they will replace them there, which is a little bit more reasonable. Now it turns out that Bugatti has a facility in the United States to replace the tires in California, so if you're in the States, you don't have to ship the wheels and tires all the way across the world just for a tire change. And the cost has come down. Apparently, a new set of 4 tires now costs about $35,000, still a crazy amount. So what is so special about these tires that they have to be sent to California and they cost so much? 2 important components. One is the speeds that this car can do. When it came out, it was the fastest car on earth. Nobody made tires that could handle 255 miles an hour, so Michelin made special tires just for the Veyron. So they're not exactly in stock at your local tire retailer. And Bugatti wants you to use these specific tires because no other tire would really stand up to the incredible speeds this car is capable of doing if you decide to go on a top speed run. The other thing about these tires is you don't just pull them off off the wheel and then stick on a new set. There is an epoxy that binds these tires to the wheel. Again, they decided to do this for the top speed run purposes, and so you can't just pull them off. This special epoxy has to be applied, and you want someone to do that who knows what they're doing. And apparently that person is in California. But anyway, next it is time to climb into the Vitesse, and there are oh so many quirks and features in here. But I want to start with the key. This is the key right here. You can see it's just a normal Volkswagen folding key that all Volkswagen Audi models used at this time period, except this one says Bugatti on one side, lock, unlock on the other. Otherwise, it is your standard VW folding key you would have gotten with a Passat. It's kind of strange, such a special car didn't get any more special of a key. Same deal with the door handle. On the outside, you can see it just looks like a regular car door handle. Again, this car was made before hypercars started doing crazy things with keys and door handles to make them all distinct, and so Bugatti didn't bother with any of that stuff. Of course, newer hypercars now have all sorts of crazy keys and door handles and everything else, but at the time, Bugatti was trailblazing and they just kept it relatively normal. But anyway, next we move into the Veyron Vitesse, and I want to start with the quirks of the door panel. Just looks pretty standard. At the bottom, you have a storage compartment. You open it, and it's the light blue contrasting color from the outside of the car inside the door storage panel. A nice little touch, a good piece of attention to detail. Same deal with the hole where the door pull is. You can see inside that, it's also the light blue contrasting color. A nice little detail you'd expect in a car this expensive. By the way, one other interesting item on the door panel is the window switches. You can see they look like fairly normal window switches, but in operation, they're backwards. You push the window switch up, the window goes down. You pull the window switch down, the window goes up, which is rather strange. Not sure why they did that. Perhaps once you enter the $2 million plus price bracket, the window switches operate backwards. Who would know? Anyway, moving past the door panel, I want to move on to this little area next to the driver's seat. You can see a few items in here. There's a little storage tray where you can put stuff. You also have the control for the parking brake, and then you have a keyhole. This is where you insert the top speed key. In order to actually activate top speed mode, you have to put a key into that little slot to let the car know, yes, I confirm this is something I really want to do, and only then will the car actually allow you to go your full 255 miles an hour. You have to have the key in to be in top speed mode, which is pretty cool. You also have two other buttons in this area. One pops open the fuel door. You press it and the fuel door opens on the passenger side, pretty normal. The other button is for oil. You press that and the fuel door opens on the driver's side, except it's not for fuel. It's a compartment containing the oil cap. You can unscrew that and add oil to the engine in there. Now, interestingly, these buttons are very close together, and so conceivably you could open up the oil door and accidentally put fuel where the oil goes. I say this is possible because in the Chiron, which replaced the Veyron, you still have the same setup. The fuel door's on one side, the oil door's on the other side, but only the fuel door button is next to the driver's seat. The oil door button has been moved elsewhere, so you have to be a little bit more deliberate if you want to open up the oil door. I wouldn't be surprised if they had a Veyron owner who accidentally opened up the oil door and filled it with fuel thinking it was the fuel door, and so they changed it in the Chiron. That's a story I would love to hear. But anyway, moving further into the interior, next thing to discuss in here is the roof, which you can see is off. I have removed it, but when it's in place from the outside, this just looks like a coupe. As you can see, it's hard to even tell this has a removable roof. Interestingly, from the inside, it's glass. I didn't know this about the Vitesse, but its removable roof is a glass panel. You can look out and see the world like it's a large sunroof. But anyway, removing the roof, a relatively easy process. To get it started, you just press this little button behind the seat. There's one of these buttons on each side. You just push it, the roof is unlatched, and then you simply lift the roof off and take it away. But it's a very large panel, as you can see when it's off, and so it does require two people in order to lift it up and take it off the car. If you try to do it with one person, I can only imagine if you dropped it, what the roof replacement cost on a Veyron Vitesse would be. Now, this roof is so large, you can't store it anywhere inside the car. So once it's off, you're leaving it behind behind if you want to go out for a roofless drive. You better hope it doesn't rain. Anyway, speaking of the roof in that vicinity, you can see behind the seats there's a wind deflector. This is permanently installed to keep wind from blowing in your face, and it has the Bugatti logo on it. It's a very special wind deflector, not just a regular one. Now, next up, also in this vicinity, between the seats, you can see there's a panel with the Bugatti logo on it. Behind this panel is a storage compartment, which you open by pressing this little button above it. Now, when I first tried to open it, it wouldn't open, and I just assumed it was broken, but that's not actually true. The truth is, it locks with the car. So, if you park your Vitesse somewhere with the roof off, you can lock this panel so no one can get access to your storage compartment. You unlock the doors, and this panel unlocks as well, and then you can open it up. And you can see it's a little storage compartment, and it has slots for 2 business cards, not just one like most cars, because if you're driving a Veyron, you will meet twice as many important business people. But while the roof and things back there are pretty interesting, probably the quirkiest quirk of this car is in the driver's side footwell, where you can see this handle with the Bugatti logo on it. It almost looks like a screwdriver. You pull it out and, well, it doesn't become any more clear what it is. It turns out that's the base for an umbrella. Bugatti gives you an umbrella with this car for reasons completely unknown to me, because no one's gonna drive it in the rain, and it comes in 2 parts. Your base is in this little holster in the driver footwell. The upper part you can keep in the trunk or whatever, and you have to connect them in case it rains, and then you have a Bugatti umbrella. Again, why would someone need this? I'm not really sure, but you have it, and it's carbon fiber. The owner told me the replacement cost for this umbrella is $60,000, so you don't want to leave it in a taxi if you're using your Bugatti umbrella. Crazy. Anyway, the other important thing to mention in the driver footwell is this little latch. You pull it and it opens up the front trunk. So let's go up there. So like I said, that little latch in the footwell opens the trunk, but actually it just unlatches it to this point. To open it, you stick your hand under here, you reach for the front latch, and then you can open it the rest of the way. And when you're in the trunk, you discover quite a few interesting quirks for such a small space. The first thing that catches your eye is this blue box. It says Bugatti on it. You open it up and it's empty, although I think this box originally contained the top speed key. This is where you keep it for when you want to go really fast. You also have another Bugatti branded container in here. That would be the first aid kit. There is a special Bugatti first aid kit. I'm sure exactly identical to all the other brands' first aid kits, but it's there, and that is pretty cool. Maybe the most interesting thing in here, though, is this divider that's just sort of stuck in the middle of this compartment. Looks rather ugly, and it breaks it up, makes it even less practical than it already is. That's there to bypass a regulation. US government regulations say that if your storage compartment is a certain size, you must have an emergency inside trunk release in case someone gets stuck in there, you're trying to kidnap them, so they can get out. In order to bypass this regulation, Bugatti sticks this panel in here, which breaks up the size of the compartment and makes it smaller so it doesn't have to install the interior trunk release. Now, once you buy the car, of course, you can just remove this panel and then you have the full trunk, but when Bugatti sells it new, the panel is in here so they don't have to add that emergency inside trunk release. Pretty crazy solution to that regulation. Now, the other cool thing up here is a little plaque that says Bugatti Automobiles Pebble Beach Concours d'Elegance 2017. That's because this was the display car in Pebble Beach when Bugatti showed off the Veyron Vitesse, and that little plaque signifies the historic significance of this individual car. But anyway, next we move back inside the Vitesse, where there are again a lot more quirks and features to cover. I want to start with the center control stack, which just looks cool. That's because it mimics the look of the grille, the famous distinctive Bugatti grille shape, the little circle on top, flat on the bottom. That is translated into the center control stack, which is a fantastic idea, and it's just really neat that they did that. And there are some very cool things about this center stack. For instance, it has 2 climate vents in the middle that pump out air. You also have a climate vent rimming the entire way around it. On the sides, on the top, that's all one big climate vent for even more air delivered to this interior. It's kind of concealed, but it's there. Pretty cool. Another interesting thing in this center control stack, you can see there's no screen in here. The Veyron originally came out in about 2005, 2006. This car was like 2012, 13. Virtually all expensive cars had screens by then, but not not this one. They chose to not include a center screen because they knew if they used the technology of the day, it would become outdated in 50 or 100 years, and people will preserve these special cars, and they don't want the screen to be a drawback in 50 years when this is being displayed at Pebble Beach once again. So it's screenless in here. It's intended to be a more timeless, longevity-based design. And it's a good thing they decided to do that, because the small screens they did use already look tremendously outdated. You can see for the radio and the climate control, you have this black and white pixel display screen, and it just doesn't look good. Certainly doesn't look modern, even though it did back in the day. So it's good they didn't do a whole touch screen in here, which would just look disastrous by modern standards. With that said, the controls they did use, I absolutely love in here. I love how they look. I love how they feel. I especially love adjusting the radio volume. This control here, you just twist the dial and then the radio volume goes up or down. It's sort of a hidden volume dial, which is neat. Same deal down below with the climate control temperature. Again, you just adjust this dial and then you can turn up or down the air temperature for the climate control. It's a nice way to integrate that, but all of these buttons and switches look and feel good like you'd expect. Now, with that said, all those controls in the center, a car like this, you'd expect it to have a backup camera, but you can't exactly do that without a screen. But they've done just that. You put the car in reverse, the backup camera actually appears in the rear view mirror. A portion of the mirror that just looked like the mirror is now the backup camera, and it can aid you in backing up. You go back into drive, the camera goes away, and you're back to having a normal mirror. It's a pretty neat trick and a nice way to avoid having the screen in there. And by the way, speaking of shifting gears in this car, it's kind of a weird process. You can see the gear lever is right here in the middle, and it operates in a strange way. To put the car into drive, you push it over to the right, and then you're in drive, and then the gear lever pops back into the center. To put it in neutral, you push it to the left, you're in neutral, again, the gear lever pops back to the middle. To put it in reverse, you push it to the left and then down, you're in reverse, and again, the gear lever pops back into the middle. If you're in drive and you want to shift gears yourself, you can just move the lever forward or backward, and that puts you in manual mode, so you're manually shifting, and you can do the same with paddles on the steering wheel. And finally, if you want to put it in park, you just press the top of the gear lever, and that goes into park. It actually is fairly intuitive once you get used to it, but it's a strange operation compared to most normal cars. Now, around the gear lever, you have 4 different and interesting controls. I already showed you the button for handling mode. That's this one. You push it, and again, the car lowers, the wing comes up like I showed you before. You also have the heated seat controls here, and it's a little dial. You can push it forward and then turn on the heated seat to 4 different stages of heating on the driver or passenger side. The last button here is marked LC with a flag. That is to activate launch control to make your Veyron feel even faster than it already does. Finally, if you want to start the Veyron, you can see the start button is at the bottom of this center control stack, but you can't just get in and press start. Instead, you get in, you turn the key in the ignition on the dashboard in the normal spot, and then you press start and the car roars to life. Anyway, next I want to talk gauge cluster. There's a lot to cover in here. In the middle, you can see once again another little screen that now looks incredibly outdated. Black and white pixel display, looks like what you would have gotten in a Volkswagen Passat from this era. Just does not look good by modern standards, but it's what they had back in '06. And again, it makes me thankful that there's no larger screen in here, because it would really look old by now if that was the tech they were using. Anyway, you have 5 different gauges in the gauge cluster, and most of them are pretty standard. In the upper right, you have your fuel gauge, as you can see. Upper left is your oil gauge, no surprise. Lower right is your speedometer. You can see it goes all the way to 280. You won't see that very often. In the middle, you have your tachometer. That's the most important thing, although the speed is given digitally in that little pixel display, so you have your speed and your tachometer in the center. The most interesting gauge, though, is in the lower left. This one shows how much power you're using. You can see it goes from 0 to 1200. Now, in the normal Veyron, it would only go up to 1000, but because this is the Vitesse with its extra 200 horsepower, it goes to 1200, and it shows you at any given moment exactly how much power you're using when you're driving around. That is a pretty cool gauge to keep an eye on. You don't see those too often, especially topping out at 1200. Now, next up, I want to discuss a little of the practicality of this car. I already showed you some of the storage compartments in here. You have the ones in the door panel, you have the one between the seats, but there's more than just that. You also have a glove box. You press this little silver button on the dashboard, pops open the glove box, and of course you can put stuff in there. Not huge, but a glove box is nice to see. And you have one more storage compartment. That would be in the center, this tiny little compartment intended, I think, for cell phones or a music player. The problem is cell phones have grown considerably since this car came out, and so you can't reasonably get most modern cell phones in here anymore. So if that was the intent, it doesn't really work, but nonetheless, it is yet another storage compartment for more practicality in your Veyron. Now, one absolutely ridiculous item I feel is worth pointing out. This car does not have power seats. It has manual seats. So if you're gonna move the seat forward or backwards, you're moving a lever and throwing your body weight in one direction or another. It's absurd. Bugatti would say they did this to save weight, since this is the high performance version of the Veyron that took out a little weight, makes the car go a little faster. I think it's absurd. That seat motor probably only weighs a couple pounds, and it's crazy to be sitting in a $2 million car manually moving the seats around, but that is the situation in the Vitesse. Now, with that said, I love the look of the seats, this gorgeous dark blue with the light blue accent stitching. It looks fantastic, and that same stitching is carried over to the center, this trim in the middle, beautiful diamond stitching with the dark blue and the light blue. It looks great. But my favorite thing about this interior is probably the blue carbon on the inside. You can see the center control stack is all blue carbon, just like the outside. Again, looks fantastic. I love this. Same deal with the door panels, more blue carbon from the outside carried into the interior. Again, looks wonderful. Very rare you see exposed blue carbon fiber in a car interior, and I just love that it matches the exterior. Really cool detail. And finally, we move on to the engine in the Veyron, and it is an amazing one. Quad turbo W16. Everyone knows this about the Veyron. 4 turbochargers, 10 intercoolers, 16 cylinders. This one has 1,200 horsepower. It is a mammoth powertrain, really crazy, and tons of amazing engineering went into creating it. Now, I can't actually open up this compartment back here to let you see it. You need special tools to do it. Bugatti limits that to experts at its service centers, whatever, so a normal person can't just pop the hood in their Veyron. But from what you can see on the outside, it is just so cool. You have the EB Bugatti logo there, which just looks so intimidating. And then 16.4 for 16-cylinder 4 turbo. And then I also love the little Vitesse touches on the bottom, so you know this isn't just a regular Veyron. No, this is a special one. And by the way, the fact that you can't open this compartment is the reason why the oil cap is accessible like it is, through that little flap on the driver's side of the car. Bugatti didn't want people messing with the engine, but they did want you to be able to add oil, since that's pretty simple, so they made oil accessible. Everything else is under this cover and not to be touched except by an expert. And so those are the quirks and features of the Bugatti Veyron Grand Sport Vitesse. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. I can't wait. All right, driving the Vitesse. Oh, this car is just so special. It's so special to me. When I was young and the Veyron was coming out, and it was just the coolest thing in the world. And there were no cars at this price point. There were no cars at this power level. There were no crazy hypercars. This was the car. And since then, all these other cars have come out, and the sheer iconic status of the Veyron has kind of been forgotten as like the trailblazer. Like, yes, we can go over 1 million. Yes, we can go over 1,000 horsepower. It was just the coolest thing in the world. Every kid I knew wanted a Veyron. Even the kids who weren't into cars knew about Bugatti. They knew how fast it was. They knew how much air it sucked in. Like, all those stats everybody knew. This car still is one of the very coolest, most special, most amazing cars. And I think history will treat it very well. Look back and say the Veyron really was a special time for the ultra high end of the supercar market. The problem with these cars specifically, though, is they're a little bit of a bear to own. Maintenance, reliability, it's a challenge. They're very expensive cars to keep around. And I think that has harmed some of the desirability, at least in the short term, since they've gone off the market. The Chiron is a little bit more usable, a little bit more reliable, a little bit easier to maintain type of car. It's just so cool. This is just an icon. This car is just purely an icon in a way that few other modern cars are. And it came out of that era that I always have felt is a very, very special era in modern times. The mid-2000s produced the Veyron. Obviously the Vitesse came a little later, but this was sort of the ultimate version of this car. And I really think that era is going to go down as one of the all-time greatest, just because it gave us so many special cars. The Enzo, the SLR, the Carrera GT, the Ford GT, and at the very top of the market, it gave us like basically the first hypercar, which was the original Veyron. Now this car benefits from a lot of the same things that all the other Bugattis do, which is that it's a very fast, very special, very exciting car, but at the same time, it's reasonably luxurious. Now, the Veyron isn't quite as luxurious as the Chiron ended up being. The Veyron has a few more shared pieces with other Volkswagen models, which is always kind of funny. And it just feels a little bit more outdated in here, but this lack of going to screens was such a great decision. It was such a great forward-thinking decision by Bugatti, because the result is you get in here and it doesn't really seem old, even though this car, ultimately Veyron came out in 2005, 15 years ago. The power delivery in these Bugattis is just unbelievable. You just put your foot down a little bit and you're just rocketed forward. It doesn't really matter all that much how much you put your foot down. Obviously, you're able to modulate it, but just like in the Chiron, the Devo, which I recently reviewed, the feeling of acceleration is my favorite thing about this car, probably in the whole of all of it. Because you don't get smashed in the face with it like when you're driving a Shelby GT500 or a whatever. Instead, it really does come on like a jet. You feel like you build power almost in an unnoticeable way, and the next thing you know, you look down and you're doing 150, and you're like, oh, well, maybe this is a little too much. All right, I'm gonna really push it, see what happens. God, it's just unreal fast. The car's just, it's absolutely out of this world, unbelievably fast. You know, I just reviewed the DO, and that car, I guess, is faster, but the truth is when you're doing 0 to 60 at this pace, it's hard to really tell. You're just focused so much on the fact that the road is suddenly coming a lot faster. Oh, it's so thrilling just to put your foot down, drop the hammer, and you just feel like the world is changing. Everything is different. You're going so fast. And again, you're able to just do it so quickly. You can get up to very irresponsible speeds and then back down to responsible speeds very fast. And so it doesn't even feel as irresponsible as it does in some cars. I mean, here we are, just a nice little Sunday drive, and then you roll on. It's mind-blowing. The car also feels tremendously stable, I should say. It's very interesting, you know. I've driven some cars where you floor it like that and you're a little bit nervous and you roll onto the throttle very carefully because you want to floor it, but you get to that point and you want to go there very cautiously because you don't know what's going to happen. A lot of those Hellcat, Demon, Trackhawk type situations are that. Those are modern cars. This car, even older, even way more power, they're able to make it very, very stable. It feels very competent. The thing that really hits me about this car, it's incredibly fast, beautiful. Craftsmanship is amazing. This was the most special version of the Veyron. There's all these things, but the thing that really hits me is just, this car was everything. This car was absolutely everything back then. It was the coolest thing on earth. And to me, you see a Bugatti, you see a Chiron and it's like, wow, that's incredible, amazing. You see a Veyron and it's like, that's my childhood. That was all I wanted when I was a kid. I'm also just, every time I get in this car, blown away by the fact that it's so easy to drive. I love the fact that I'm driving around in probably the most iconic car made in the 2000s. And yet I can sit here AC on, kind of, you know, lightly on the steering wheel in relative comfort. It's like a very rational car, which is just hard to even believe, but it is. And it just goes to show, it's proof of their engineering prowess, that they were able to create a car that wasn't just fast, because a lot of car companies were doing that. There were a lot of top speed only, pure fast cars, like the SSC Ultimate Aero, that came out later, and all these other cars that were just about speed. Even Koenigsegg, it was performance, it was speed more than anything. And Bugatti was able to do basically the same performance and speed, but also make it feel like a Bentley in here. And it still does. And everything in here is just incredibly high quality, and it's an amazing combination of everything. And so that's the Bugatti Veyron Grand Sport Vitesse. I have always admired the Bugatti Veyron for its ridiculousness. The fastest, most expensive, most powerful, most ridiculous car imaginable back at the time. And frankly, all these years later, it's still tremendously impressive, and I'm thrilled that I had the chance to review one. And now it's time to give the Vitesse a Doug score. Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the Veyron isn't the most beautiful car, but it's still very special and quite attractive, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Acceleration is absolutely mentally insane, and it gets a 10 out of 10. Handling is sharp, but given the size and the age, it's just not quite on the level of some more purposefully track-focused exotics, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Fun factor is as high as it goes, and it gets a 10 out of 10. Same deal with cool factor. This will drop everyone's jaw, and it gets a 10 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 46 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. The Veyron was never exactly ahead of its time, and it's starting to feel a bit old, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Comfort is nice enough for a car like this, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Quality is excellent in terms of materials, which are fantastic, but reliability and ownership costs are notoriously problematic on these, and it gets only a 7 out of 10. Practicality is minimal given the small storage space, 2 seats, and the panic attack you get by simply driving it, and it gets a 1 out of 10. Finally, value, and these are more valuable than a normal Veyron and also rarer, but still absolutely enormous money, and I fear how the value will hold up long-term given the ownership costs, and it gets a 6 out of 10 for a total daily score of 22 out of 50. Added up, and the DOUGSCORE is 68 out of 100, which places the Veyron Vitesse here against rivals. It's near the bottom, but that's a bit deceptive because it's ahead of the regular Veyron and within 1 point of basically all its contemporaries, the Koenigsegg CCX, the Pagani Huayra, the Zonda. Where the Veyron loses out is handling. It's just not as sharp as these cars, and with good reason. The Veyron is all about speed and the engineering required to get it there, and all these years later, it's still an icon.